He's here.
Okay, let's go.
He's sitting right there.
Awesome, we're ready.
Okay. Okay, can you put the music? Hello, good evening. Welcome everybody for our Texas Drive for Democracy. Are you excited to be here? Oh my God, I could not be more proud of this crowd and this community for showing up over and over again. This is wonderful. I'm so proud and so happy to see
We're here at
all of you
Stevenson
here,
Park,
all of your many faces.
and
I know you
it's
all
a little
brought
after 6
questions
o'clock, so we're
because
just
we're
getting
going to have a
started.
conversation.
And we've got
We have a
Elizabeth
special
who's
guest.
speaking right now.
I know you know who that
and a bunch
is,
of
and
great
you're all
people
excited to
who've
see
come
him.
out. So,
Let us know how excited
more people
you
showing
are.
up every second. And if you're watching this and you're in Abilene or anywhere nearby,
Excellent.
come on by and see us. We're at Stevenson Park.
We've
We're
got some
just
people
getting
to thank,
started.
and I want to thank them for being here, and especially you, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This means so much to our community that you're all
There's
interested
Jim Ward right
in
there.
voting and why our voices matter, right? So, I want to thank Billy Enriquez, AAC Board of Trustee member, Abilene ISD, for being here. He consistently shows up for this community. He represents our children. Let's thank Billy Enriquez for being here today. Excellent. We also have Matthew Berkeley, who is founder of the Juneteenth Party and also one of the founding members of Abilene's African American Council of Leaders. Thank you for being here. Thank you, DJ Smith, for coming on out and playing some music. Yes. Thank you, Abilene Christian Democrats, for showing up, registering our voters. I want to shout out Mackenzie McPherson, former president of ACU. She's been a consistent advocate of voter registration on college campuses, and we need our young voices to speak up. Right? Always driving the forefront. We've got people who've shown us how to do it. So many people to thank. Thank you for being here. KTAB, KRDC, K-Texas, Abilene Reporter News. We got the West Texas Tribune. Thank you for being here today.
Skid.
So,
S-K-I-D.
oh yeah, we've got the Texas Democratic Party.
Look at who's
Thank you,
here.
guys,
It's
here
Miss
in
Jasmine.
Abilene. Thank you, Lucy Worker and Christine, for being here. Right? We have to show up in our rural communities, and people are showing up in Abilene. They're coming out, and that's why we've got attention here. That's why we've got a special guest who's here hitting the streets without knocking doors in this neighborhood this afternoon. Knocking doors, inviting people to come, and that's what we need. We need people who are engaged with the community, asking for your vote. So let's talk about voting and the reason why we're here. Don't want to delay this much longer because we do have a conversation to have. But voting is important, right? We believe that as Americans.
Thank you.
I'll be
And
watching that.
unfortunately, there's always somebody who is afraid of our voices and afraid of what we might have to say. Is scared of the power in our voices. Scared of your power. Right? And it doesn't matter what
This is
ideology.
DJ Skid, everybody, right there.
whatever that word is, I can't say it right now. Ideology may espouse. Right? We know who they are because there's no limit to the low to which they would stoop to silence you, to silence me. They're afraid of what you might have to say. And when we call out their injustice, when we ask for accountability, right, they decry it as identity politics, cancel culture, right, when you call it out. But we didn't invent identity politics or cancel culture, did we? No. When they said, our votes matter, our voices matter, and if you don't identify
food
in our
trucks.
group, you're XYZ everybody else, we're going to cancel your voice. Right? We didn't come up with that. That's not the way it ought to be. So, a lot of people think that this is maybe a red or a blue issue, but it's not. It's not. If you're an American who believes in our democracy, this matters to all of us. It matters to all of us. Because the quality of our democracy depends on the level of participation we have. So the question I have to ask you, and I hope you have things to say, is do you believe in the power of your voice?
This is Luke Warford.
The way that they who want to quiet your voice believe in your power. They're scared of your power, and they'll do anything to stop your voice from speaking. Do you believe in the power they know you have? What are you going to do with your power? How are you going to protect that power? So I want to introduce Chris Daughtery. You know him. He's a son and father of this neighborhood. You know him from his advocacy, you know him from his youth mentorship program, you know him from his books, you know him from his public speaking. He's going to be introducing our special guest. You know him from Boys to Gentlemen. But before Chris speaks, I do want to introduce Luke Warford from the Texas Democratic Party. So please welcome Luke, and he'll hand off the mic to Chris.
Thank you. Hey everybody, how's everyone doing? Good? Yeah. Thank you so much to the Taylor County Democratic Party, to Elizabeth, for having us, for being out here, for bringing folks together. Thank you to Beto and Powered by People. It is great to be in Abilene today. It is a beautiful day to be outside talking about democracy, being back together. I just want to make a couple quick remarks, and then I know Chris is next, and then we'll bring up Beto. I think, can folks hear me?
Yep.
Great, I love it.
Here we go. Like that here.
I think as many folks know here, and it's something that we're super excited about, and that I know we were talking earlier to Demetrius and others about voter registration, right? About getting people registered to vote, helping them access their constitutional rights. And the reason we're out here today in Abilene, the reason we were in Lubbock yesterday and Midland the day before, is because we at the Texas Democratic Party know that we can't win the state. We can't put Texas without registering voters. Here in Abilene as well. Yeah.
It's amazing, Elizabeth.
And so we, on Tuesday, you guys are getting a sneak peek of this, but we'll be announcing that voter registration is our top strategic priority for the session, for the cycle ahead. And we are so excited to have more than 12,000 lucky Democratic voters.
Chris Daugherty.
Silence is the loudest thing on earth. One of the hardest things for us to recognize and understand is that when your voice is silenced, how many different things come behind it. Just think about you being in a place of really having a need and not being able to communicate that need. Think of a baby not being able to cry. Someone is hungry that's not able to ask for food. And when I started to really look into this, I'm gonna be perfectly honest with you. I'm only 36. I've only taken politics seriously probably the last 6 years. And I wanted to be transparent with that because I fit into a category of people that said, voting doesn't matter. That stuff I'm not worried about that. I don't care who president is. I don't care who's mayor. I'm gonna go to work the next day. I'm gonna do what I do. I'm not worried about it. I might say something like, oh, it's in God's hands. But that was a cop-out. That's not taking ownership for my community. That's not taking ownership for my family. So as I started to get more into politics, I started to learn just how dirty of a game it is. How many different games are put into place to silence a certain person or silence a certain community. And I started to see how vicious it could really be from a political standpoint. And as I started to pay more attention to that, I really started seeing the need for stronger communities. So not just from a political standpoint, I want to step off there for a second. What can we do to be stronger here in Abilene? What can we do to make sure young men are growing up with fathers in the household, daughters with mothers that are closer to them from an understanding, not operating from frustration for lack of resources, but to really come in a place where we live in a mindset where we got comfortable with saying it takes a village to raise a child. But what happens when that village is not available? What happens when you can sit in your home for 2 years and not even know who your neighbor is? That's the current status of where we are right now. But the question is, do we have to stay there? And I'm here to say no. We can actually be in a place where I can be impactful, not just in my home. Yes, that's where it starts. But I can really love my neighbor. I can put things into service. I want to have a caveat right now. I know I'm introducing Mr. Beto. I had the opportunity to walk with him today. And I followed him a little bit, but one thing that stood out to me more than anything, with all of my time spent with the conversations and everything going, if I had to sum him up in one word, it would be service. As I had the conversation with him, his most crowning moment in politics and the things that he's done has been focused towards service of people. And at the end of the day, that's what we become most focused on, is how are we able to look our brothers and sisters in the eye and say, what have I done to make sure that your life is better? One of the biggest premises that we have, boys and gentlemen, is community contribution. What am I giving back to my community? What am I putting in place to where a young man that may not have a father, does he still have plenty of role models that will come in and speak life into him? Or does he have to sit back in a place? And as I talked to Mr. Beto today, just from a statistical standpoint, I'm waiting on my 5th child. I have 5 beautiful boys, one on the way. And if I set all of my sons right in the living room in front of me, I can count them out. And the reality is at least 2 of them are more likely to go to prison than they are to go to college. That hits different. You know, sometimes we get lost in numbers and statistics, but really set it down. If you had to look at your child and say to them in honesty that you're more likely to serve penitentiary time than you are to walk across the graduation stage for a university. That's something that hit me to my soul. But it's something we can do about it. One thing that I've noticed that as we started with silence being the loudest thing on earth, I want you to hear that if your vote didn't matter, because crowd participation, please raise your hand if you have at least heard the phrase from somebody that voting doesn't matter. Everybody. But my question is, if it didn't matter, why is there such an effort to make sure that you can't do it? So that's the question I want to ask. Before we get too lost in the politics affiliation, whether you're Democrat, Republican, Independent, my question is, at what point do you realize that your voice is powerful? Otherwise, they wouldn't put the effort in silencing you. Exactly. Says we're gathered here today in this lovely Abilene, Stevenson Park, lovely weather, sitting with all these beautiful people. I want us to really take a moment to sit back and ask a reflection question. Am I committed to not just put out my political preferences, not just say whatever is politically correct, but am I really ready to have the conversation to make sure that my brothers and sisters that I live with, the people that I say matter, my community, am I committed to make sure that they have an opportunity for a good life? So as I introduce the speaker at hand, again, I want to reflect back to our conversation that we had earlier. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Beto, he's not here to push just the Democratic Party. He's not here just to rally a vote in a certain direction, but to really have a conversation about that even being possible. We're really here to make sure that every voice is heard, and I've seen this in action, so I have no problem with sitting here today. I'm grateful for all the work that he has done. If you haven't already researched Mr. Beto, please go do the research. He's really put some action behind the words that he's saying. So I take honor in introducing somebody that's committed to service of our communities. So please, put your hands together for Mr. Beto O'Rourke.
I want to thank you all for taking some time out of your Saturday to spend it with us, your friends from true West Texas, coming to East Texas. And every time I come to Abilene, I'm impressed anew by how kind, how warm, how welcoming you are to me. The first time I came here as a stranger to your community, you reminded me at El Phoenix restaurant, where we broke bread and tacos and had a really good time and a great conversation together about the future of the state. It was in 2017. I knew I was in the right place. I felt like I was at home because you made me feel that way. Every time thereafter that we came back, in the coffee shops, in the bars, packing every seat at the Paramount Theater at 1 p.m. on a weekday. Why aren't you guys at work on the weekdays? But not my question to ask. You came out and it was wonderful to be with you, to see you. And though we might not have won that race in 2018, we did some really impressive things together. And as Chris said, we didn't do them as Democrats, we didn't do them as Republicans, we did them as Texans, we did them as Americans, we did them as human beings. We took a state that had ranked 50th, dead last in voter turnout, and produced the largest voter turnout in a midterm election since 1970. We saw young voter turnout increase 500% over the last midterm election. Thank you, Abilene Christian, and all the great universities here who made that happen. We got out there, and we stepped up, and we stood out, and we raised our voice, and we had our vote counted. And that's what matters in this democracy, that is of, by, and for the people. You know, we're not a week past Memorial Day, where we remember those who gave their last full measure of devotion to this country. They literally gave their lives for all of us to be here right now. I was at Fort Bliss National Cemetery on Monday with my kids. And after we listened to the wonderful service, heard the closing prayer from the chaplain, we just walked through the cemetery, and we could see from the dates, this young man died in Korea at the age of 19. This gentleman in World War II at the age of 23, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. It was really powerful, and I wanted my kids to see that, read the names, see the dates. Ulysses, my 14-year-old, I said, this guy was 5 years older than you were when he lost his life for you to be here right now. I want you to remember that. And I also couldn't help but think about where we are as a country right now, and that those men and those women who died in service to all of us, those great veterans who are here right now, those of you who served at Dyess Air Force Base, like Chris and others who are here, who put your life on the line and were willing to lose it so this great country could continue. We have all inherited your sacrifice and your service. We're the beneficiaries. We are the heirs of what you put forward. And what we do with this inheritance, with what you made possible, will define us, this moment, and this country forever. That's what this conversation is about today. At least that's what I'd like it to be about. And so I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank DJ Skid for getting us started off in the best possible way with music, making this about joy as well as about democracy. I want to thank Elizabeth for convening this and bringing us all together and doing a great job on the weather tonight. And so Elizabeth, thank you for that. I want to thank Chris, who is my new hero in life. As Chris mentioned, we knocked on all these doors, and I hope Charlotte, who we met, and Karma, and some of the other residents over here in the Carver neighborhood were able to come out tonight. Chris loves this community, and this community loves Chris. Folks he's never met before, he treated like family, and they opened up and responded. And here are two strangers at their door, peering over their fence in the backyard. There were no trespassing laws broken, by the way. We did all this and respected private property rights, but we wanted to make sure that we gave everyone a chance to come into this conversation. And you could tell Chris really meant it. So I want to see you there, and I want to hear you. We have 2 microphones tonight. I'm going to give one of these microphones out into the crowd and bring you into the conversation. And that really touched me. You know, he was talking about service. And not only did he serve in the Air Force, not only did he put on the uniform, but he serves this community every single day with boys to gentlemen. This extraordinary book that he's written that has changed lives and improved families, and his work in the classroom in making sure that our education is about reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also understanding ourselves, our culture, our history, and what is possible for each one of us individually, what we can do together as a community. So Chris, I want to thank you for everything that you're doing and the leadership that you've demonstrated for this community, for this country. And I said this to Chris, I don't know if he's ever going to want to run for office in his life, but I told him when he does, I'm on the campaign team, right? I'm holding a clipboard, I'm knocking on doors for you as well. So just tell us when, okay? And we're behind you. So back to Memorial Day, we're at the cemetery with my kids, recognizing this extraordinary service and sacrifice, and thinking about where the country is today, and wondering just how did we get here? How is it that in the energy capital of North America, I was just in the Permian Basin 2 days ago in Midland, where we have secured energy independence from the rest of the world, and my thanks to the oil field workers, to the folks who work in the oil and gas industry, to the people who made Texas the one that freed us from our dependence on the rest of the world and literally powers this state and so much of this country. How in the world did the energy capital of North America find itself in a position in February where when a winter storm hit us, we literally could not keep the lights on, we couldn't keep the power running, we couldn't keep the heat going, and we couldn't keep the water running? During that winter storm and the failure of our electricity grid, more than 700 of our fellow Texans lost their lives. Young boy trying to get to bed under a pile full of covers, froze to death on one of those winter nights in February. A young girl died next to her mother of carbon monoxide poisoning as they tried to get warm in the garage by running the motor, not knowing that they were killing themselves in the process. Hundreds more, whose names we may never know and whose stories may never be told, died in just that way in this state in the year 2021 of our Lord. How is it that in this state, in this age of modern medicine, that more than 50,000 people succumbed to the COVID virus? And how this pandemic didn't hit every community in the same way? We saw Native Americans, African Americans, Latinos, and communities of color decimated by COVID. My hometown of El Paso, Texas, after we dropped our public health safeguards last summer, became the epicenter of the pandemic. More people died per capita in El Paso than in any other community in the country. So many died that they had to set up not one, but 10 mobile morgues to keep all the bodies. They had to call in the guard to move them because there weren't enough people in El Paso to do that anymore. How is it that we couldn't keep each other safe out of the hospitals and alive? 50,000 people. And then this, in the last legislative session in Texas, instead of focusing on the electricity grid and making sure that we can count on the power in future storms, instead of addressing the pandemic and the distribution of the vaccine and making sure that we're ready for the next healthcare crisis, our legislature decided to make it harder to vote in future elections. They decided that they were going to do away with Sunday morning voting, sometimes referred to as souls to the polls, disproportionately used by African American voters across this country. Very targeted group of people that the legislature was looking to keep out of our elections. They said to those with disabilities, you're going to have to disclose your personal, private medical information if you want to vote an absentee ballot by mail. Now imagine that veteran who's just come back from Afghanistan with post-traumatic stress disorder or traumatic brain injury or military sexual trauma. She doesn't want to tell a complete stranger what she endured. We took her word for it when we asked her to go overseas and put her life on the line for this country. Why can't we take her word for it when she wants to vote absentee by mail right now because she has a disability earned in service to this country? This elections bill that they proposed in Texas was going to allow free rein to partisan poll watchers to intimidate voters without the election judge having any ability to control their behavior or make sure they leave the polling place if they're being disruptive. We know, unfortunately, from the long history of voter suppression in Texas that is typically aimed at some communities to empower other communities. And we're bringing it back right now in the year 2021. And then probably most alarmingly of all, there was a provision snuck in at the last moment, literally in the final hours of debate, that will allow the state of Texas to overturn lawful, legitimately, democratically decided elections based on the allegation of fraud. Why does that matter? Because we have a former president who trafficked in the big lie that somehow there was widespread voter fraud, concentrated, by the way, in his allegations, in African-American communities in Philadelphia, in Atlanta, in other states that decided the outcome of that presidential election, and that somehow he's the rightful winner of that contest and that we now have an illegitimate president in the White House. Though his Secretary of Homeland Security called it the freest, fairest, most secure election in American history, unfortunately, his access to that big microphone, the bully pulpit, means that millions of our fellow Americans believe that. And so based on that big lie, we now have debated in Texas the ability to not accept future election results. Imagine in 2024, the Democratic nominee wins the 40 electoral college votes of Texas. The Texas legislature alleges fraud in the election and refuses to accept the results. 245 years into this experiment of democracy, that is the exception in the course of human history and not the rule. That is the exception on planet Earth today and not the norm. That we freely choose those who will represent us and have a voice and say in the direction that our city, that our state, and that our country takes. What Abraham Lincoln called the last best hope of Earth could perish from this planet if we allow it to. Those are the challenges that we face. These are the things that are on the line, that these brave veterans laid down their lives for, that is now up to us to defend and protect, and if we can, expand. That's the challenge. What are we going to do about it? To echo what Chris just said. What are we committed to doing? There are many things at our disposal. John Lewis said, voting is the most powerful nonviolent tool we have in this country. We can make a decision that we're going to vote. We can sign up with the Taylor County Elections Department to become volunteer deputy registrars and be able to sign up our neighbors, our friends, and our family to vote. Those who before thought that voting didn't matter, or that their voice didn't count, or that we just have to allow this to work its will and its way. Convince them by listening to them, talking with them, and sharing our stories that they should have a say in what happens next, and registering them to vote. But there's also a bill pending right now before the United States Senate that I want you to know about. It's called the For the People Act, and it's the most significant piece of voting rights legislation to come down the pike since the 1965 Voting Rights Act, signed into law by our fellow Texan, Lyndon Baines Johnson. The For the People Act would remove these voter suppression obstacles that I just described to you in Texas, in Georgia, in Florida, in the other states that have already passed them. It would reduce the power of corporations and big money and the wealthy to pull influence and decide the outcomes of elections and legislation. It would make Election Day a national holiday. So no more having to ask for time off of work if you're making $7.25 an hour and working not one, but 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet. You can be guaranteed the right to be able to vote. It makes voter registration automatic. You turn 18, you are registered to vote if this bill becomes law. No more worrying about whether or not you're registered at the right place. And then there's this. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you probably don't like the fact that in this country right now, members of Congress choose their voters instead of the other way around. They sit behind closed doors, they draw those political boundaries, and they decide how they're going to win the next election and stay in power. And listen, folks, though I'm a Democrat, Democrats do this stuff as well as Republicans. It's a matter of power and keeping that power at the expense of people. This bill, the For the People Act, would set up nonpartisan, independent redistricting commissions in every state to make sure that the playing field is leveled and the system is unrigged. Now, this bill has already passed the House of Representatives and is now pending before the United States Senate. Most of the Democrats, who happen to be in the majority, have indicated their support for the For the People Act. The president has said he will sign it. It will do more than anything else to preserve and expand and safeguard this democracy for the next 245 years. So what's the problem? Thus far, for whatever reason, the For the People Act has not become the national priority that it should be. And it reminds me of another time when this country was up against voter suppression, laws that sought to disenfranchise some based on the color of their skin and keep them out of important decisions in their communities. In the 1950s and the 1960s, as it had been in every decade since Reconstruction, African Americans had a very hard time registering to vote and actually casting their ballot. From 1924 to 1944, that's 20 years, and 4 of them were in the middle of World War II, where African Americans were laying down their lives overseas for this country. If you were a black person in the state of Texas, by law, you could not vote in the Democratic primary. It was called the white primary, the Democratic white primary. Imagine that. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't as though they were trying through other means to keep people from voting. It was literally in black and white by the letter of the law. There was the poll tax, the literacy test, the how many jelly beans are in this jar before I will allow you to register to vote. And in 1964, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Andrew Young went to pay a visit to President Johnson in the White House. And they made the case, based on everything that I just described, that we needed a National Voting Rights Act. And President Johnson responded, Dr. King, I hear you, you're right, but I just don't have the power. I don't think I can get the members of Congress to vote for this. It's a very similar situation to where we find ourselves right now. And so Dr. King and future Ambassador Young leave the White House. And Dr. King and Andrew Young start talking about what they can do next. And Andrew says, I guess we're done. I guess we're defeated. And Dr. King says, not so quick. Ambassador Young says, what do you mean? And Dr. King says, we've got to get the president some power. And over the course of the next year, they found that power for President Johnson. They took to the streets. They had community conversations just like this one, maybe even in Abilene in 1964 or 1965, perhaps even in this neighborhood. Men like John Lewis put their bodies on the line, tried to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, to march and fight peacefully and nonviolently for voting rights. John Lewis was beaten within an inch of his life, was almost killed doing that. 24 years old. Life had just begun and it almost ended for him. President Johnson convenes a joint session of Congress a week after Bloody Sunday on March 15th, 1965. And those senators and those House members, Republicans and Democrats, he refers them to John Lewis and his sacrifice and his willingness to give his life and to put it on the line for all of us. And he challenges those members of Congress to do the right thing. He says, ladies and gentlemen, pass this Voting Rights Act. And they did. And he famously predicted that for that and for the Civil Rights Act the year before, Democrats would lose the South for a generation. But he was only half right. We lost the South for many generations. It's still in play, it's still being contested. But that political sacrifice, talked about what veterans have done for this country, what civil rights organizers have done for this country. But sometimes people in positions of public trust and public service, they also sacrifice for this country. Those men, those members of Congress, many of them from the South, knew that they could vote for this and never win another election again. And they did so all the same. And for the first time in American history, we had a true multiracial democracy in America. That's what's at stake right now. That's what they're trying to roll back in Texas with these voter suppression bills. Our answer to that has to be the same answer that Dr. King gave. We've got to give President Biden that power. So in addition to becoming a volunteer deputy registrar, where you can register other voters, bring them onto the rolls and out to the polls, in addition to reaching out to your state representative and state senator Tell them that you don't want voter suppression in the state of Texas. I think it's also important that we reach out to President Biden at the White House. Give him that power. Call the switchboard. Let him know that we want him to do the right thing, whatever the political costs, because once we lose this democracy, we might never get it back again. That's the charge that I would love to leave you with today. But I came not only to speak and to share my point of view on this incredibly important topic, but also to listen to you as well. And so Cynthia, who is right here, has another microphone in her pocket. And if you'll raise your hand, she'll bring that microphone over to you. And I'm all ears, as are all of us, to listen to you. Whether you have a point that you want to make, a question you would like to ask, I want to make sure that I'm here to hear it. And last thing, before we get to hear from you, there are some clipboards that are being held by some wonderful Powered by People volunteers. If you have not already signed in, please do so. I'd love to stay in touch with you. And if you can't remember all those points of action that I just laid out, I'd love to send them to you by email and say, hey, here's the number for the White House switchboard. Here's how to become a volunteer deputy registrar. Here's the phone number for your state senator and your state rep so you can get in touch with them directly. That's what I'd like you to consider doing. Thank you for having me out, and looking forward to what you all have to say. Thanks.
I looked on the computer about what treason is, and it said that any group that's trying to get rid of another group is treason. We got the Republicans all over the place doing that. How come no charges are being set for them, or even considered accessory treason? You know.
So when we're talking about this threat to our democracy, it's not just restricting who has access to the ballot box. It's the fact that, John Lewis called voting the most powerful, nonviolent way to affect change in this country. When people lose hope and begin to despair, when they begin to believe these big lies, they start to look at violence as a way to change things in this country. And on January 6th, we saw a storming of the United States Capitol, the citadel of democracy. 5 people lost their lives, including a Capitol police officer. And those who stormed with political banners and the Confederate battle flag sought to kill members of Congress. They erected a gallows in front of the Capitol where they tried to hang the Vice President of the United States at the time, Mike Pence. So yes, everyone involved with that sedition should be brought to justice. And I know that the FBI is pursuing everyone that they were able to identify from the video that was taken. But your question also begs another one, which is, what about the members of Congress, including the junior senator from the state of Texas, who trafficked in these conspiracy theories and lies and actually voted to overturn the lawful, legally decided election? 3 editorial boards in the state of Texas, including in my hometown, have asked that Senator Cruz resign his position of public trust because he can no longer be trusted with that. And not because he's a Republican and not because I'm a Democrat, but because I believe in the rule of law in our democracy, because I believe there should be consequences for sedition. I think there should be some accountability. So thank you for raising that. Appreciate it. Cynthia. Yeah.
My question, Beto, is what is your opinion about getting rid of the filibuster?
The filibuster, for those not up to speed, and I just recently got up to speed on the filibuster, requires that in the Senate, where there are 100 members, you need 60 votes, a supermajority, to get anything passed. And what that means, in layman's terms that I can understand, is nothing ever gets done. You have a a 1-vote majority by Democrats, 51 votes if you include the Vice President of the United States, to 49 votes or 50 votes for the Republicans. Now, I believe in compromise. I believe in consensus. I believe in seeking the common ground and then working from it. But I also believe that this country is in crisis right now. And I mentioned the crisis in our democracy. And to allow the voting rights bill that's before us to fail in deference to the filibuster, which is itself a creature of segregation and, frankly, the white planter class in the South that used it to keep political power away from African Americans and away from civil rights and voting rights legislation over the last 100 years, would be to deny that sacrifice and that heritage that I talked about earlier. So the way somebody put it is this woman, Amanda Littman, who runs a group called Run for Something, that really resonates with me. Look, folks may or may not know what the filibuster is, but they will know that if after 2 years in power in the White House, in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, if the Democrats weren't able to get anything done with that, they will be out of power going forward. If we don't have a Voting Rights Act passed because of that filibuster, I think it's very possible we lose democracy. So my hope is that the filibuster, which can be changed with a simple majority vote of those Democrats, is changed now while we still have time. The Senate Majority Leader has called for a vote for the For the People Act this month. So your phone calls to the White House could not be more important or more timely than they are right now this month. So that question on the filibuster is going to be called as well. And my hope is that we change it and, if possible, end it forever. Thank you for asking.
Okay. My question for you is, if Governor Abbott succeeds in closing the children's shelters that are being used right now for the migrant children, does he have an alternative plan of what to do with these poor children?
The question's about the governor's recent decision to revoke the licenses of daycare facilities that provide care for undocumented migrant children. Many of these are kids whose parents are seeking asylum, refuge in this country. And no matter which faith tradition that you belong to, I haven't found one yet that doesn't call upon us to think about those who are less fortunate than we are, the most vulnerable, the stranger in our midst. And talk about a stranger in our midst. Someone who's traveled 2,000 miles, the length of this hemisphere, to flee crushing poverty, brutal violence, droughts, storms, the consequences of climate change. I would not send my kids on a 2,000-mile journey unless I had no other choice but to send them on that journey, because it is a perilous one, and we're uncertain what will happen at the end of it. So once they arrive here, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, whatever you think about immigration reform or asylum policy, to force those kids to bear the brunt of the consequence is just not right. It's not just in my book. And so I would love to work with Governor Abbott and with anyone in a position of power to do something about this, to make sure that we take care of those kids and their families who are only seeking some help, and that we then address the root causes that would lead somebody to make that trip. In El Salvador, in Guatemala, in Honduras, in those Central American countries, their rule of law, their institutions have been hollowed out by drug trade, illegal drug consumption in the United States, drug control policy in this country, the civil wars in which we participated. We have a debt to pay there. We have an obligation and a responsibility to fulfill. And I think working in partnership, we can address that so no child ever has to flee those 2,000 miles. But while we're working on getting that right, let's not punish those kids. And let's treat them with the kindness and empathy that we're known for here in Texas. And let's remember at the end of the day that the immigrants here in Abilene, like the immigrants in my hometown of El Paso, have made us better and stronger and safer by their very presence. And so we're very lucky to have them. Thank you for asking the question.
Welcome to Abilene. So, are you going to let us test our voting rights by running for governor?
You want the mic back?
Thank you for the warm welcome and for the question. I'm going to give this fight for voting rights and this attempt to save our democracy my all, because I just cannot think of anything more important at this moment. That's what brought me here with you. But I sure hope we prevail. And if we do, at the end of this fight, if there is some way in which I can serve as a candidate or serve in some capacity not as a candidate, I will do it. I'm in for the distance. I'll be working with Luke and Elizabeth and everyone here in Abilene to make sure that this state realizes its true potential. But I got to tell you, I would love an excuse to come back to Abilene, to be with you, to rally with you, and to work with you. So know that it's on my mind. And as soon as I have a decision on that, I'm going to come here to let you know. So thank you for asking. Appreciate it.
So growing up, I was always told to collect cans and make planters out of milk cartons and turn off the lights, but it seems like we've gotten to a point where we may have done some irreparable damage to our environment. And so what do you see as the best way to get laws passed that are going to quickly and effectively stop climate change?
I think the solutions should come from Texas. I mentioned the pride of place that our state has in providing the energy independence of this country. And I appreciate that, given the fact that we have found ourselves at war or in conflict in the Middle East for most of my adult life. And I'm grateful that the Toyota Tundra that I drove here from El Paso is burning gasoline that was extracted here and refined in this state. But I am on the same exact page that you're on. What we're doing right now is absolutely insufficient to the challenge that we face. I mentioned what's ravaging Central America right now. Hurricane Harvey in Houston that dumped more rain on that city than has ever fallen from the sky in recorded history in North America. The winter storm that we just experienced, this extreme weather is not an act of God. It is a consequence of our emissions and our excesses and our inaction in the face of the science. So what if Texas, which has helped us to solve so many of our prior energy challenges, was put to the test on this one? It's not lost on me that as I drove in from Lubbock and counted about 2 billion windmills or wind turbines as I drove in, that we generate more wind power than any other state in the country. Most people don't know that outside of Texas. They just know us for oil and gas. We could soon be the state that generates more solar power than any other state in the union. Solar and wind are the two fastest growing jobs in America. What if we said, Republicans and Democrats, we're going to invest in the infrastructure, along with President Biden, who wants to give us some federal money to do that, to build more wind and solar and geothermal capacity? What if we completely electrified our lives so that we're not using carbon resources to try to power what we do in this state? And what if the jobs and the capital investment and the profits that came from that all were centered here in the state of Texas? I want us to be unafraid of the future, right? Not anxious about what's going to happen, not fearful that we're going to lose our jobs, but excited about this challenge before us. Someone's going to figure it out. That could be China, it could be the United States. And within the United States, it could be Pennsylvania, it could be any number, or it could be Texas. And I want it to be Texas. So that's what I would like to see happen in this state. To that end, I'm supporting the president's infrastructure plan that makes so many of these necessary investments. And I'm going to do everything I can with that administration to draw those investments to Texas. I just hope that we have willing partners here on the ground to make the most of it. So thank you for asking the question. Excellent.
Okay, my question is, okay, with the homeless. Okay, now, Governor Abbott, passed a bill that there's no more homeless tents, no more homeless under the bridges. So what are we going to do about the homeless situation? Excuse me.
I was just learning from someone that I met earlier today that Abilene has become a leader on this in terms of reducing the level of homelessness in the community. So
For veterans.
Especially for veterans.
Yes,
And so
zero.
I think there's something for us to learn from what Abilene's been able to do. But this is the truth that I've learned by listening to those who've experienced homelessness. No one chooses that. No one wants that. No one likes that. No one who is experiencing homeless wants to stay homeless. But in a state where the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, in a state that is the least insured in the United States, meaning that we have folks in Texas dying of diabetes, of the flu, of curable cancers. They're one medical disaster away from bankruptcy and losing their home and being out on the streets. In a state that has absolutely failed to address problems in domestic abuse and family violence. In fact, I met a woman living under a bridge in Houston, Texas, and her husband had threatened her life, was abusing her, was the sole breadwinner for her family. And so when he was arrested and incarcerated, she lost the ability to cover the mortgage and found herself living under a bridge, and was going to be living under a bridge for a full year because it takes 12 months before you qualify for rental assistance in that community, at least at the time. So if we just invested in people, let's make sure that we have universal health care. Let's make sure that minimum wage is $15 an hour. Let's make sure we have paid family leave so that folks can take care of their jobs and their business and ensure that their kids are being taken care of. I guarantee you we can address homelessness, not by criminalizing it, not by outlawing tents and camping, but by doing the right thing by the people who live in our communities. So those are some suggestions. And actually, I'd love to return the microphone to you. If you have ideas, I'd love to hear it. Yep.
How y'all doing? Like, for real. I'm just asking, you know what I'm saying? I'm just asking. How y'all doing? For real. Like, how y'all doing? Like, for real. Where y'all spirit at? Huh?
Where your spirit?
Yeah. Hell yeah. But the man just now, black. I got you one time. Yeah. Check me out, big fella, one time. Check me out. Let me be me. Okay. All right, no, that's right. You know, that's right. Yeah. Let me be me.
Answer the question.
I got this big fella. Yeah. Okay. Bird. Yeah. Who?
Beto.
That's right, big fella. Beto up in the house like that. Yeah. Yeah. Listen. Come on. I got you, man. Check me out. Trust me, man. I got you, man. I'm baby Tupac, bro. For real, man. With the braids in my hair, like
Bird. Come on. Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Hey, love y'all. Love y'all. Love you.
Thank you.
Love you. I'm about to get started. Love you. Hannah.
I've always wanted to ask somebody. I've been married for 14 years to a woman that's never been a legal citizen of this country. Though throughout the years, we've always tried to give her citizenship. And then when Trump became president, they started locking people up. And then when Trump became president, they started locking all those people up. My little girls would always ask me, are they gonna lock up my mom? Are they gonna take my mom away from me? And I would always tell my little girls, I don't know. I don't know what's gonna happen. And I don't lie to my kids, so I would try to be as honest as I could to them. But now that I got a chance to talk to you, what can you tell me that I have to look forward to? What is gonna happen in the future?
I'm grateful that you were willing to share your story about your family to bring us into this. Sometimes it's a matter of policy, or it's an abstract thing if it doesn't touch our lives, or if we don't know someone whose life's been touched by it. So the honest answer is I don't know, because
Are we gonna get the fourth stimulus check?
the frustration that I think so many of us have is that President George W. Bush was going to try to solve this. President Obama was going to try to solve this. President Trump, in his own way, said he was going to solve this, maybe rounding up everybody who was undocumented and sending them back to their countries of origin, building a wall and making Mexico pay for it. President Biden, as a candidate, was going to solve this. And I don't know that we're any closer
to getting that solved. And I believe in President Biden, and I've had a chance to get to know him, and I believe he really wants to do this. It's almost a matter, when we were talking about democracy and voting rights, whether we really want to do this, and whether he's going to feel that pressure and be given that power by all of us to do the right thing. And so those who are willing to share their stories, those fierce advocates of immigrants, and I especially think of those dreamers that I've met with, who say, look, I want to be a resident, I ultimately want to become a citizen, but I don't want to do it if I have to sacrifice my parents, who were the original dreamers and made the decision to come here and bring me here. I want us to follow their lead. And I think we can do it in the following way. I was in La Mesa, Texas, a few years ago, and I was meeting with some cotton growers, all of whom happen to be Republican. And if there's a Democrat in La Mesa, I have not met her or him yet, but they were really nice, very warm, very welcoming, and we talked about immigration. And I asked the gentleman, I said, well, tell me your views on immigration. And he said, well, you know, if I'm honest with you, I have to acknowledge that despite all the rhetoric that Republicans often use and that President Trump has been fear-mongering with, when I think about everyone I've ever known in La Mesa, no one's ever had their job taken by an immigrant. No one's ever had their kid's place in school supplanted by an undocumented child. No one's ever had to pay for somebody else to be able to be in this country. He said, I think it's just good politics. And so I wonder, you know, who knows, it's just an anecdote, but I wonder if reaching out and listening to more of these Texans in unusual places, or not typical for a Democrat to be in La Mesa and Snyder and Monahans and in Abilene, maybe that brings us a little closer to where I feel like we almost got in 2014 under President Obama, or where we almost got in the second George W. Bush administration. But I know that we've got to keep on trying, and I know that it's not going to happen if we shame people and say you're bad for not wanting to do this, or if we say this is just the right thing to do. I think they've got to meet you and listen to you and say, I was really moved by this guy who's been married to this woman for the last 15 years and cannot get her legal status in this country, and whose kids go to sleep every night afraid that their mom might get deported back and they won't ever see her again, because that has happened to a lot of families in this country, and we understand why they're fearful about it. So I mentioned the filibuster, thanks to your question earlier. End the filibuster, or at least change the rules so that it's used in only the rarest of circumstances. Not only do you pass democracy reform, but if President Biden and that Democratic majority in the House and the Senate really want to see an immigration law passed, they will be able to do it. So that filibuster and ending it holds the key to everything, including immigration reform. Thanks for asking the question. Appreciate it.
All right, we got a lot of questions. I will try to get to as many of you as I can.
Regarding COVID, it's affected a lot of people, but mainly the immunocompromised. And with the governor dropping most of the mandates, it's really affecting the immunocompromised people, especially because the vaccine is not as effective in the immunocompromised. What can we as citizens and the people who represent us in the government do to overturn the mandates that were dropped in regards to safety?
It's a great question. I mentioned how many lives we lost in Texas, and just since the governor dropped all public health protections a couple of months ago, I think we've lost another 5,000 of our fellow Texans. I've got to think some needlessly so. In other words, if those protections were in place, they might still be alive. I want Governor Abbott to be successful. His success is our success. I want him to be successful against this pandemic. I want him to listen to you and understand that perhaps despite his best intentions, wanting to make sure that we can all return to our normal pre-pandemic lives, that there are some for whom this is incredibly risky. I think the rule of thumb that my wife has asked me to apply in my behavior and activity is, if I'm uncertain when I go into a place of business or I'm close to somebody to wear a mask, because even though I'm vaccinated and my risk of contracting the virus is lessened and my risk of passing it on is lessened, you just never know, and you can't be 100% certain. So I think the fact that you were here and called our attention to this challenge means that you probably helped improve the behavior of everybody who's in attendance. I would ask, if you're comfortable doing so, to reach out to the governor and share that with him as well. He uniquely has the power to do this. One quick thing, there are 254 counties in Texas, 254 county judges, thousands of mayors. One small change he could make, and maybe this is a bipartisan idea, is instead of making a statewide mandate on masks, what if he said in a given county or in a given community, if the local public health authority says, we don't have a vaccination rate yet that is quite safe for people not to be wearing masks, we're going to require that. And we're just going to do it based on the facts and the science and the health guidance and go from there. That might be something that allows for some local control and keeps all of us safe. So thanks for asking the question. Appreciate you being here. Yep.
It's nice to meet you in person. And I wanted to tell you, I did a lot of work for Mr. Biden on advertising in Abilene, and I didn't think he was listening to me. And do you know, every suggestion I made came to pass. He followed it to the letter.
Nice.
And I happen to know that he likes you very much and respects you. And I don't only want you to be governor, I want you up there in the cabinet in the White House with Biden. Where you can do us some real good. Because Texas is so eaten up with Republicans, I don't know if we're ever going to get there here.
Cynthia, get her number, because if Biden is listening to her, then we need to stay in touch. So thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you for coming to Abilene, Beto. I was watching you a couple years ago. They asked you a question, and you're the only politician that actually fielded the question about reparations. You gave an open and honest answer about that you didn't have the information at that time. Do you have any more information now on how you feel about that subject?
Yeah.
Thanks for the question and for being here. I've listened to people who understand this and whose families have lived this and who I think should be leading the conversation. And what I've learned from them is that we first have to understand the true story of this country. When we do, we recently saw the president commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa massacre, where more than 300 people lost their lives and an entire community of Greenwood was burned to the ground. And the history, the story literally, of what took place was erased from the textbooks for decades. I think that's why it was so important the president was there. And that it shed a light not on what happened only in Greenwood, but what happened across the country, across the United States. We understand that 400 years in to this country, marking the beginning of the United States, not in 1776, but in 1619, that the extraordinary wealth and success that we enjoy today was built on the backs of those who were kidnapped in West Africa, brought across the oceans, enslaved, and made to build this country up literally on their backs. And though some may say the question of slavery was addressed at the end of the Civil War, and some may point to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 as though to say, you now have equality. Listening to my friend Chris today talk about equity makes me rethink what it is we have to do as a country. Because the descendants of those who were enslaved, who were kidnapped, who were brought to this country, who built its wealth, have been meaningfully denied any participation, any meaningful participation in success. Beto, how can you say that? What does that mean? There is 10 times the wealth in white America today that there is in black America. Brown versus Board was decided in 1954. I would argue that schools in America are more segregated today in 2021 than they were then during that important civil rights decision from the Supreme Court. And when you think about the fact that there are more people behind bars in America than any other country on the planet, and there are more people behind bars in Texas than in any other state in the country, and that the overwhelming majority of those who are arrested, especially for nonviolent drug crimes, are people of color, specifically Black Americans, then yes, the case has been made to me that we need reparations in this country. Thankfully, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who represents the district in Houston, Texas, has filed a reparations bill. Now that bill would ensure that all Americans learn this history and this story, because I think people can be forgiven, and I heard a lot of empathy from Chris today, and absolutely no judgment from him for those who don't understand this country's true story and everyone's lived experience. I think people can be forgiven, and I'm saying white people, who may not know the full story and may not understand all this and say, hey, what's the big deal? That's not my fault that all that stuff happened, and may not realize the advantages that accrued to them at the expense of others. I believe in the common goodness of our fellow men and women, our fellow Americans. I believe that once we share that story, maybe not everyone, but a lot more of us will be willing to do the right thing once given the chance. And so I want to follow Congresswoman Jackson Lee's lead, ask President Biden to help get that passed through the House, passed in the Senate, and signed into law. And then I think some of the real healing can begin in this country, healing that's been waiting 400 years to happen. So thank you for asking the question and giving me the chance to answer it. Appreciate it.
You started out this conversation with the fact that the voting rights bill has to be passed. That is absolutely fundamental to every other question that's been considered here today. I truly believe that. I believe that climate change is the worst thing we have going, but nothing's going to be happening unless that is done. We must pass that bill. You said to call President Biden. Would it not do also to call the Arizona senators and Senator Manchin and eat them out for pretending to be a Democrat?
Yeah, the question is, we should call the White House, but should we call Senator Manchin in West Virginia, Senator Sinema in Arizona? I don't know that it would hurt. I honestly, if I'm being candid, I don't know how much it's going to help. The number one imperative of any member of Congress, House or Senate, is to get reelected. And so they're going to care what the people of Arizona and West Virginia think. But let the people of Arizona and West Virginia and the man in the White House know that all these great people came together today in Abilene, as they did last night in Lubbock, as they did the night before in Midland, and are all calling for voting rights in this country. President Biden is going to check the message twice that he gets from you. And he's going to say, are you sure this isn't Austin and Dallas and Houston? That it's these three cities in deep red Texas that want voting rights in America? And if we all do this, and if we do this across the country, and if we perhaps take a page out of John Lewis's book and put our bodies out there as well, and anyone interested in organizing a march in Abilene and bringing truth to power and making sure that you are seen and that you are heard, much the way so many Americans did last summer, I think that helps all the more. But I think we've got to do everything we can. As a great Republican, Teddy Roosevelt said, do what you can with what you have where you are. That describes us at this moment, and that's what we're beginning to do right now. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Hi there. So you've talked about the minimum wage, and we've talked about homeless people, and I fundamentally believe that a big way that we can address problems like that is to support workers' rights in America, because the majority of Americans are workers. So I would like to know your thoughts on the PRO Act and what you have done to push that in your area of influence.
The PRO Act essentially fundamentally makes it easier to organize, especially in states like ours that are so-called right-to-work states. It would make Texas a right-to-organize state. And if you want to make sure that you, the employee, have some leverage with management or with these multi-billion-dollar corporations, the ability to band together with your fellow workers will allow you to do that. And some wonder whether it makes Texas or America less or more competitive. I think when workers are doing well, when they're paid a living wage, so they don't have to work 2 or 3 jobs, when they can take care of their kids, when they can afford rent, mortgage, and higher education, this country will, by definition, be wealthier. We'll be able to buy more of the things that we actually produce in this country to begin with. So the PRO Act makes a lot of sense. I believe that I was a co-sponsor of it when I was a member of Congress. It's something I supported when I was very, very briefly a candidate for the presidency. And it's something that I'm glad that you're talking about right now, because this is, again, not one of these Republican or Democratic issues. It's about working people in this country, and working people in this country are what make this country work. So let's get it done. Thanks for asking. Appreciate it.
All right, so Beto, thank you for being here in Abilene. It means a lot to me and everybody else. My name is Joey. So one thing I want to speak on, that I speak on a lot, is not only voting rights, but representation at the local level. That's where it starts. And then we go up the ladder, we go up the chain. Some people call it a bureaucracy, and it is to a sense. Okay. So in Abilene right now, we do not have equal representation on our city council and in our school boards. I'm an advocate of single-member districts versus the status quo at-large voting system. I've been speaking about that for about 4 or 5 years now. I have many mentors in the audience that brought me up to speed. My good friend Bill Enriquez, Doug Mendenhall, he wrote several articles on it. At what point does a community like Abilene approach the federal government and say this isn't right? We are on the cusp of being a majority community, and we're being denied seats at the table.
That's right.
Because with the at-large voting system, you may have 3 people that live on the same street that are serving on the city council. You may have 5 people that go to the same church that are serving on school boards, versus areas like this community where we could have somebody like Chris, we'd have somebody like, Billy Enriquez on city council. We are a diverse community. We're a growing community. We have various sectors of the city that are very unique and have cultural heritage that are very unique. So it's time that we make some changes. And I just wanted to pick your brain on that real quick. So thank you.
Yeah. I'm really interested to know that you don't have single-member districts already. El Paso used to have at-large representation in the city council, and the situation you described meant that South El Paso, which tends to be lower income and actually has one of, if not the poorest zip code in the state of Texas, didn't get any of the resources because no one ever got elected out of South El Paso. So there was no advocate, there was no champion, there was no fighter bringing those projects to that part of town. We decided on single-member districts, and now you have a designated representative who is the voice for that community, for Chihuahuita and Segundo Barrio and the neighborhood that I live in. You pose the question in the context of voting rights and democracy, and this seems like an issue that should be addressed perhaps in a bill like For the People. And if not there, then in some other provision that ensures that everyone's represented, because democracy is about voting for sure, but as you said, it's also about representation and who has the chance to actually run for office and who has a chance to actually be heard once those are elected, once those folks are elected. So let me do some research. You asked a really good question. I want to give you a good answer. And then I'd love to get back in touch with you and see how we can be helpful. Thank you, Joey. Appreciate it. Yeah.
Okay, I know we're way over, so we're going to do a speed round, and these are going to be our last 6 questions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
All right.
Hi, I'm Victoria. I just wanted to start out and say happy Pride Month. It's June, so exciting. And I know that Abilene is having their first Pride Parade, so awesome for you guys. On top of that, I want to just showcase the anti-trans bill that was recently killed in Texas, and I want to know how we can continue to protect our LGBTQ plus community in Texas. I'm getting married, and it's not fair that the rest of us have only just now got that right in my lifetime, so I want to know how we can continue to protect those people.
You know, I think that so many of these questions come back to this issue of democracy, making sure that people are represented. 7 million eligible Texans didn't vote in the 2020 election. 7 million. So folks call this a red state. I call it a non-voting state. Imagine if those 7 million were registered, some were, some weren't, and had all obstacles removed. And imagine the kind of state legislature we would have. They may not be working on a transgender sports bill. They may be working on fixing the electricity grid, or preparing for the pandemic, or investing in wind and solar so that we can lead the world in the next generation of energy technology. But what I think defeated that bill was people like you traveling to the state legislature, literally, and testifying before those committees. And it's kind of like your question earlier. It immediately produces an empathy in the listener to see a child who says, look, I'm already struggling as a transgender kid. It's not necessarily the funnest thing in school. You know, transgender kids are far more likely to harm themselves and really struggle with some things that are even tough to talk about out loud. And one of these kids, and I listened to her, she said, playing sports is one of the few times in my life that I feel like I fit in. And I don't have to worry. I'm not even thinking about anything. I'm just, you know, following that ball or making sure that I'm helping my teammates do well. And you want to take that away from me? And I think her presence reduced that from a talking point and elevated it into something that was very human and transcended all that stuff. So I think democracy, it's voting, it's representation, it's showing up and being in front of those who represent you and reminding them of their job. So just like you did this with me today, I hope that you'll do that in the next legislative session where they promised, unfortunately, to bring this bill back. So let's make sure that we all step up and get out there and do that. Thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
Actually, that was partially my question. So I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Andrew, and I'm a transgender 16-year-old who has been on testosterone for 2 years. And during this recent legislative session, I've been in Austin fighting for my right to medicine, to keep parents like mine from being designated child abusers for allowing their kids to transition, and for fighting kids like me to be able to play in sports of their correct gender, which is their gender identity. So what is your opinion on this legislation, which you kind of already went over? What do you have to say to trans youth and adults like me, but specifically to trans youth, because obviously we can't vote and it feels very helpless to be in this situation? And what is your opinion on the Equality Act?
So first of all, thank you for being here. I think this is the kind of extraordinary courage that I've been talking about that's necessary at this moment. You and others who will bear the brunt of this legislation were willing to make that trip to the Capitol and stand before those lawmakers who were, in some sense, trying to vilify you or scare the rest of the state about you. And you did so with extraordinary generosity and compassion and lack of judgment. From not a single transgender child or the parent of a transgender child did I hear a word of judgment or condemnation or accusation. It was this graciousness of, let me bring you into my life and help you understand what this means to me and what this will do to me and what this will change for me and what will no longer be possible for me. And let me also remind you that I was here before you in 2017 when you tried to stop me from going into certain bathrooms because there was somehow a crisis in bathroom policy in our schools that needed the state legislature's attention. And how I know I will probably be back here in 2023, the next legislative session, because you're probably going to do something again. But I'll come back every single time. I'll drive from Abilene or Corpus Christi or Del Rio or Longview or El Paso, whatever it takes to do this. Well, that really got me, Andrew. I was there in the chambers to testify against the voter suppression bill, SB 7, but they heard this transgender sports bill before that. And I signed myself up to speak, to say just that, to say, you know, after hearing all these children and their parents, how could you continue to consider this bill? And thankfully they listened to you, and that bill was defeated. But I think you know this better than anyone. We're gonna have to remain vigilant, and we're gonna have to continue to be willing to go do that. On the federal level, you mentioned the Equality Act. Much in the same way that the For the People Act in the United States Senate would stop SB 7 in Texas, the Equality Act would do a lot to prevent states like ours from singling out or punishing members of the LGBTQ community in Texas and in other states. So for that reason, I was a co-sponsor of it when I was in Congress. I support it, and I hope that we can get the Equality Act passed. Thank you for being here, Andrew. Grateful.
Thank you for being here and give me that selfie earlier. I do really appreciate that. First thing I just want to say real quick was during the ice storm, you and your team made all those phone calls to the people that were most vulnerable, and seeing that and seeing our senator run across the border and then blame it on his kids kind of made me feel a little uneasy, so I do appreciate that. What can we do for the issues that matter, like healthcare, minimum wage, immigration? Instead of this left versus right, what can we do to bring people together so we can have bipartisan votes for the issues that really do matter to most people?
Listen, I'm a Democrat, and I want to work with Luke to register more people and to win elections in 2022 and 2024 and beyond. But I don't want to wait for that. And to your point, I don't want to make this a partisan issue. It's 2021, and so do we just wait for that next election and that next legislative session? Or can we get to work now talking with people from across the aisle who may see things a little bit differently than we do and find that common ground? That's what I would like to do, and it sounds like that's what you would want to do. When I was in Congress as a brand new Democrat in the minority, political minority, Republicans were in the majority. I remember I was serving on the House Veterans Affairs Committee, and we had a real problem with veteran suicide in this country. 22 veterans a day, every single day, taking their lives. Absolutely unconscionable and unacceptable to me, and I wanted to change that. What I learned is that those veterans who had an other than honorable discharge were many more times likely to take their own lives, because the consequence of that other than honorable discharge, that bad paper discharge, meant they couldn't go to the VA, and they couldn't have their TBI or their PTSD or their MST or other wounds and conditions suffered in battle or service. They literally couldn't get it treated, and they were suffering and they were dying as a consequence. And I said, look, there's got to be, there's some responsibility you have for the status of your discharge, but you shouldn't have to pay with your life. And I found a Republican in the majority to work on that bill with. And I was real proud of myself, because I knew if I authored it in the minority and shouted all day long, it was going nowhere. And I upset so many members of my own party. They said, look, Beto, I know you have the best of intentions, but you're making this Republican look good. You're making him look bipartisan, and it's gonna be tougher for us to beat him in the next election. So just cool your jets and withdraw the bill, and we'll get more Democrats elected, and then go do it next year. And I said, by next year, I don't know how many veterans we will have lost. We're gonna do this year. So we got this passed in the House, we got it passed in the Senate, and then though I agree with him on almost nothing, Donald J. Trump signed that bill into law, and we started saving lives after that. So what if we did that on the minimum wage? What if we did that on expanding Medicaid? What if we did that on climate? The wind infrastructure, the investment that allows us to generate more wind than any other state, it wasn't a Democratic governor that helped to make that possible. That happened under George W. Bush and Rick Perry. Again, I may disagree with them on a lot. I'm grateful to them for doing that. So Democrats and Republicans can work together, and they should. And where we disagree, we disagree. But let's make sure that we can still make this thing work. So thanks for asking the question.
All right, our last three.
First off, I want to thank you for making Ted Cruz sweat in 2018. Secondly, Texas just passed the quote-unquote heartbeat bill. And I don't know where all of you stand on women's reproductive rights, but more and more women and more children will die due to this bill being passed. And it's hard to think about. I have a deeply emotional connection towards women's reproductive rights. And what do we do to protect these women from such a hard decision? And how do we protect them from death? How do we protect them from ridicule? And how do we, as a nation, as Texans, as Abilenians, come together and figure out what to do about this bill?
On the bill itself, and it was recently signed into law by the governor, so it's got the force of law now. As you probably know, it's going to be challenged in the courts by any reading of the precedent, including Roe versus Wade. It's unconstitutional and it will be struck down. It'll be very expensive for the state of Texas. It means all of us are going to pay for it. And it's going to strike fear into the hearts of many who need access to reproductive health care. I mentioned that we're the least insured state in the country. It's, in plain terms, it means it's very hard to see a doctor here in Texas, or to get your prescription filled, or to take your child to a therapist. But it also means that because of the closures of reproductive health care clinics in Texas, in a state that's already struggling to take care of folks and provide enough medical professionals, we are at the epicenter of a maternal mortality crisis. Women are dying in this state at a frightening rate, and Black women are dying at 2 to 3 times the rate as white women in this country. So when, again, perhaps for the best of intentions, you pass a bill like this one, perhaps you don't understand that you're denying life-saving health care to women in the state who may want to go to a reproductive health care clinic just to see a doctor, who may want to go for contraception, who may want to go for a cervical cancer screening that could literally save their lives based on what is detected by the doctor there at their clinic, who may want help being able to carry their child to term, who may have a medical question that will go unanswered if they're not able to get in there. When we have the conversation on that basis, my very pro-life, very Catholic mother, lifelong Republican, she and I can find some common ground. And she says, Beto, I didn't understand that it would do all those things. Thanks for clarifying that for me. And much in the same way, we have so many courageous people who are willing to talk to their state legislators. I think those women who traveled to the Capitol and made their case, those like you who are willing to step up and call attention to this issue, it makes it a little more likely that someday we're going to have a chance to have legislation that's not going to hurt women in the state of Texas. And when we think about life and protecting life, we're going to include the lives of those kids at those daycare centers that are no longer going to be able to be taken care of, those kids who died in the winter storm, those kids who are going out without the ability to put a full meal in their system every day. So there's a lot of lives that need to be looked after in this state. And I want to make sure that we include all of them in that. But thanks for being here and for the question. Appreciate it.
Hello. Similarly, going on with Kenny's question, I was wondering how, as a young woman in Texas, I'm supposed to feel safe when I have pretty much zero control over what happens with my body, or the fact that contraceptives are becoming harder to acquire. And if I were to get pregnant, even if it wasn't my fault, say I were raped by somebody, how I'm supposed to go through and carry with that child, or how in general any woman in Texas is supposed to feel safe when they are not getting the things that they need.
And on top of that, how are we supposed to, like, women are responsible for their contraceptives. Like, men, there are contraceptives for men other than condoms. I don't know if y'all knew that. But how are we supposed to, like, protect ourselves, advocate for ourselves, and be able to say, I mean, just because it's abortion doesn't mean we're not pro-life too. Pro-life is not anti-abortion. It's every child matters, every life matters, the kids without opportunities, without parents in their lives, like every single one of them. But there are lots of pro-life people who are just, don't get an abortion, you're killing them. But what are we doing with the immigrant children? What are we doing with the homeless children? Like, how do we better advocate that it's not just anti-murder?
Just briefly to add to what I said earlier, I'm convinced that if we elected more women to public office, we would have better outcomes in terms of legislation that affects women and their ability to make their own decisions about their own bodies. So there's a great outfit in Texas called Annie's List, and it's named after Governor Ann Richards, the last Democrat, by the way, to be elected governor in 1990. Look, if you don't mind, look up Annie's List and find out how we can do that, because I think when you bring a woman's perspective to bear on these decisions that we're making about women's bodies, I think we're going to have something a lot better than what you see today. So anyhow, thanks for being here. Appreciate it. Yep.
Alrighty, this is our last question of the evening. I hope it's good.
So I had the same question, but those three kind of like already did it. So here's my next question. I think a lot of like alternative kids don't really see any point of politics because it doesn't affect them. But you know, me, a straight white male, now I know that I gotta attend political rallies if I want to make a difference. How do you think these underage kids with basically no legislative power are gonna hold politicians accountable for things that they themselves might not like, but just because they're underage, they have no power to do anything about it?
You know, after the murder of George Floyd that we all witnessed, thanks to that heroic young person who kept her cell phone video going the entire time so that there was some accountability and ultimately the beginning of some justice. Those protests that we saw in Vidor, Texas, did you have them in Abilene, Texas? It sounded like you had them in Abilene, in El Paso, in literally thousands of cities across the country. They were so often led by young people. And you have seen cities and state legislatures and the United States Congress introduce bills based on what those young people were protesting for. In fact, in Texas, they actually introduced the George Floyd Act. And though it didn't pass, some provisions, including those dealing with chokeholds, did pass and will be signed into law. That's just one example, but I'll tell you this. I cannot think of a major moment in American history where significant change was produced that young people were not in the lead. I think about, you know, I was mentioning Memorial Day and being at the Port Bliss Cemetery. All those gravestones, I mean, these were 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds who died on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day. I think about John Lewis. I mentioned almost getting beaten to death at the age of 24. When he was 20, he got on these Greyhound buses during the Freedom Rides through Mississippi and Georgia in the Deep South. And those buses were firebombed. The passengers were beaten bloody. They literally risked their lives. 20 years old. That guy changed human history. He pushed Johnson to pass the Civil Rights and then the Voting Rights Act. And so in much the same way that it's been the young people asking about reproductive health care today and climate justice and so many of these other important issues, I actually think they're the ones who are going to make this change happen. I think it's incumbent upon me and all of us who have the power to do so to demonstrate to them that we're just as committed to unrigging this system, so that in addition to taking to the streets and protesting and posting on Snapchat and being at this meeting, that voting and registering and participating in our politics, and I think most importantly, running for office so that they too are holding positions of public trust and are making this change, that's what we've got to do. And so, to end where I began, if we can pass this bill, which is the Voting Rights Act of our day, the For the People Act, we're going to give young people who have the most finely tuned bullshit meter that exists on the planet confidence in this system. They'll know that their vote matters. They'll know that the obstacles have been removed. They'll know that this playing field is level once again, and they know that they have a shot. And so I'm going to give my full devotion to this for as long as it takes to get this done. I hope that you'll join me in this fight. Thank you all for being with us tonight. So grateful to you. Special thanks to Chris and his family for joining us. DJ Skid, to Elizabeth for organizing, all these Powered by People volunteers, and all of you for coming out. Thank you so much.